Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass Bill H.R. 3152 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3152, a bill to impose sanctions with respect to countries, individuals, and entities that engage in any effort to acquire, possess, develop, transport, transfer, or deploy Iranian missiles and related goods and technology, including materials and equipment, and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, and the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous materials on this measure.
Without objection.
I also ask unanimous consent to place into the record an exchange of letters with the chairman of the Judiciary Committee.
Without objection.
Thank you, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, Iran poses an existential threat to the global balance of power, threatening our national security as well as those of our allies and regional stability. General Kurilla, who I met with at the Munich Security Conference, the commander of the U.S. Central Command, testified to Congress this year that Iran possessed both the largest and most diverse missile arsenal in the Middle East and the largest and most capable unmanned aerial vehicle or drone force in the region, which is why the passage of the Fight and Combat Rampant Iranian Missile Exports Act is so vital. For years, we've seen Iran and its terrorist proxies use these weapons against the United States, as well as our partners and allies throughout the Middle East. In January 2020, Iran launched a missile attack on U.S. troops in Iraq. Iranian UAVs are frequently used to attack U.S. service members and personnel in the Middle East. These UAVs are a deadly threat that have killed and wounded Americans. Iranian UAVs have also been used in destructive strikes on Saudi and Israeli-linked targets. Iran frequently provides these deadly weapons to its proxies, including Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iraqi militia groups. And now, Iran, their lethal drones are wreaking havoc outside the Middle East. Hundreds of these drones have been deployed by Vladimir Putin against civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, becoming a key element in his unprovoked war of aggression and war crimes. For years, Iran's missile and drone proliferation to its terror proxies and to Russia has taken place in outright violation of the United Nations international embargo on Iran's missile and drone programs. We know that the Ayatollah, Vladimir Putin, and Iran's terrorist proxies don't care about violating UN resolutions, but other countries do. Next month, these international restrictions on Iran's lethal missile and drone programs will expire after 15 years. And I'm deeply concerned that the marketplace for Iran's missiles and drones will expand. Dangerous autocrats, war criminals, terrorists around the world will turn to Iran for missiles and drones, just as we saw them doing following the expiration of the UN arms embargo on Iran in 2020. That's why it's urgent that the House pass my bipartisan bill, the Fight and Combat Rampant Iranian Missile Exports, or Fight Crime Act. The bill, which I was proud to introduce with Ranking Member Meeks, imposes strict mandatory sanctions on Iran's missile and drone capability to fill the gap left by the expiration of the UN restrictions. Everyone must know that if they purchase Iran's weapon of war, they will be frozen out of the U.S. financial system, denied use of the U.S. dollar, and denied access to the United States. For years, Iran and its proxies have rained hell on the Middle East from the sky with their attack UAVs. Now Iran's dangerous arsenal is enabling Russians' war crimes and devastation of Ukraine. We cannot wait to act until the UN restrictions expire. We need to prevent these weapons sales now before these deadly missiles and drones are on the battlefield. And in fact, Iran is working with Russia, inside of Russia, to make these very drones. And so with that, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For decades, the United States and our allies have harbored grave concerns regarding Iran's ballistic missile program. Leading among those concerns is the fear that they are being developed to one day deploy a nuclear warhead. But we have also experienced Iran's short and medium-range missiles that pose a direct and deadly threat to American forces in the region and the territories of numerous allies and partners. Iran currently has more than 3,000 ballistic missiles in its stockpile. In recent years, despite international pressure, these missiles have achieved a much greater range and accuracy. Iran has also supplied precision-guided missiles and drones to proxies in Lebanon and Syria. Iran's growing missile capabilities could one day allow it to threaten Europe and the United States mainland directly. Without a doubt, it is in the interest of the United States to prevent Iran from further expanding its missile capabilities. Today, global sanctions are in place which aim to limit Iran's missile program. They are found in the UN Security Council Resolution 2231. And unfortunately, they are set to expire in October of 2023. Russia and China's presence on the Security Council has made it impossible to negotiate an extension of these multilateral sanctions. Mr. Speaker, in October, when the UN regulations expire, Iran would be free in the eyes of the UN to develop nuclear weapon delivery systems, including ICBMs, that could reach the United States homeland. Let's be clear. Iran has never abided by the missile restrictions outlined in the Security Council resolution. But when the sanctions expire, it would open the door for Iran to advance its missile program by utilizing technologies more freely from around the world. Upon expiration of the sanctions, Iranian leaders will immediately gain access to items it cannot easily acquire domestically, such as gyroscopes, sensors, and numerous other sophisticated components necessary for modern ballistic missiles. And upon securing these technologies from abroad, Iran could begin to reverse engineer them and begin domestic production as it has done in the past. That is why, together with our allies, we must act. I applaud the European Union for telling Iran they plan to retain their own European Union ballistic missile sanctions set to expire in October. Today, we want to send Iran the message that the United States intends to do the same. That is why we are considering this bipartisan legislation introduced by Chairman McCall that imposes mandatory property blocking and visa sanctions on anyone involved in the supply, sale, or transfer of or support for Iran's missiles and drones. The legislation also requires the executive branch to submit a report on the Iranian missiles and drones to Congress, specifically outlining their strategy to counter this menace. Mr. Speaker, there is near global consensus that Iran should not be allowed to acquire a nuclear weapon or the missile that could help them carry one. I encourage all of my colleagues to support this important bipartisan legislation. Therefore, I encourage my colleagues to join me in supporting this measure, and I thank Mr. McCall and Ranking Member Meeks, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Speaker. I want to thank Congresswoman Dean for her strong support for this measure and her leadership. At this time, Mr. Speaker, I have no other speakers and am prepared to close and reserve the right to close.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman is recognized.
And Mr. Speaker, I have no further requests at this time. I'm prepared to close if the other side has no other speakers.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume for the purpose of closing. The threat of Iranian missiles and drones is real. The clock is ticking, and Congress, the United States government, and the world at large needs to act. This bill is an important measure to prevent Iran from being able to acquire more sophisticated technology as a result of the expiring sanctions. I thank Chairman McCall and Ranking Member Meeks. I thank you, Chairman, for introducing the bill. I strongly urge my colleagues to support this measure, and I yield the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume. Despite what you may hear about partisan divides, our committee, I think, stands apart. This bill to impose sanctions on those doing business with Iran's missile and drone program was introduced by myself and the ranking member, Mr. Meeks, of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And it passed our committee unanimously. It has over 225 co-sponsors with a mix of Republicans and Democrats. Congress and the American people are keenly aware of the destructive power of Iran's drones, and we are absolutely committed to reining in this threat. We're united in delivering a bipartisan message to countries around the world: do not buy or acquire Iranian drones and missiles. Do not associate yourself with the IRGC or with Vladimir Putin or with Iran's terrorist proxies. Putin and the Ayatollah may try to ramp up their military cooperation, but we will do everything in our power to stop them, and in doing so, safeguard free democracies around the world. So with that, I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan measure, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 3152 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative.
Mr. Speaker?
For what purposes, a gentleman seek recognition?
On that, I request the yeas and the nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 589 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 90, H.R. 589, a bill to impose sanctions on the Supreme Leader of Iran and the President of Iran and the respective offices for human rights abuses and support for terrorism.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, and the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on this measure.
Without objection.
I also ask unanimous consent to place into the record correspondence between myself and the chairs of the Judiciary, Financial Services, and Ways and Means Committee.
Without objection.
Thank you, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, we all know that Iran has committed brutal human rights violations. This regime silences dissent and suppresses the truth. And those who dare to speak out face severe consequences, including death. 1 year ago, 22-year-old Mahsa Amini was murdered by the Iranian regime, the so-called morality police, while in police custody. Iran's morality police had detained her for a false crime unthinkable to most of us here in this chamber. The crime, failing to properly cover her hair. The people of Iran were outraged by her brutal murder and by the range of injustices that the Ayatollah subjects Iranians to, day in and day out. This outrage led the brave people of Iran to rise up in peaceful protest, demanding change. Sadly, but not surprisingly, the regime responded with a violent crackdown against the protesters. They detained tens of thousands of their own citizens and killed hundreds of more. The regime choked off access to the outside world by blocking the internet. Disturbingly, violence and isolation is how they deny their own people their freedom and their voice. The international community has failed the people of Iran by failing to compel their oppressors to stop this abuse. We have many sanction laws designed to address Iran's regime's human rights violations. However, it is clear that many officials and institutions in Iran have not yet been sanctioned for their role in these abuses. That is why it is so important that we pass this bipartisan bill that was authored and introduced by Representative Banks from Indiana. We must require the president to formally determine whether specific high-ranking regime officials and institutions meet the criteria for imposition of our sanctions and then act based on those determinations. The Biden administration has its own political agenda when it comes to Iran. This administration wants to broker a bad nuclear agreement with Iran and has made it clear that it is willing to sacrifice leverage in the form of sanctions enforcement to do so. My long-standing concerns only grew when we learned that the administration's chief negotiator, Rob Malley, was being investigated for problems with his security clearance. This administration must be transparent about these allegations and how they have impacted the last 2 years of Iran's policy. To the administration, I say this: we must not sell out the Iranian people to reach a bad nuclear deal with Iran. A nuclear Iran is simply not acceptable. We must fully enforce the laws on the books that we have in order to stop the grotesque human rights violations taking place in Iran. And that is why, as we approach the one-year anniversary of Mahsa Amini's tragic death, and it is so fitting that we do it here in this chamber this week, the Congress must show the world that we have not forgotten her, Mahsa, or the millions of Iranians who have experienced violence, oppression, and even death at the hands of the regime. So I urge unanimous consent for this measure, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there is no debate in Congress about the nature of the Iranian government. The supreme leader of Iran murders, tortures, and abuses his own people. He denies Iranian citizens freedom and democracy. He guides proxy forces meant to destabilize numerous regional countries. He has threatened to wipe Israel off the map. And he is developing a nuclear program that has stockpiled enough highly enriched uranium for several nuclear warheads. I believe there must be costs associated with this behavior, and the United States is delivering those costs. The Mahsa Amini Human Rights and Security Accountability Act, or the Mahsa Act, is a bill that would require the President of the United States to determine whether high-ranking officials in the Islamic Republic regime in Iran should be listed under existing U.S. sanctions for human rights abuses and support for terrorism. If an Iranian person or entity is found to meet these criteria, the legislation strongly encourages the executive branch to sanction that person or entity to the fullest extent of the law. Foreign Affairs Committee Democrats understand the despicable nature of Iran's supreme leader and his regime and the need to hold them accountable. The supreme leader is currently sanctioned under EO Executive Order 13876, which blocks the property of the supreme leader and his office, as well as persons determined to have provided material support to the supreme leader or his office. As of April 20, 2023, 112 persons have been designated for sanctions pursuant to this order, 75 entities, 36 individuals, and 1 vessel. Some of these designations were made by the Trump administration, and some have been made by the Biden administration. The supreme leader is fully cut off from the American financial system and is not allowed to travel to the United States. Mr. Speaker, it is worth noting that other prominent Iranian leaders currently under strict American sanctions include President Raisi, 2 of Iranian's vice presidents, 7 cabinet ministers, including the ministers of communication, culture, defense, intelligence, interior, and petroleum. Companies and subsidiaries tied to the supreme leader in the sectors of energy, textiles, mining and chemicals, and financial services are all under strict sanctions. Let me be clear. There are more sanctions on the supreme leader and his cronies today than there were a year and a half ago. Applying a maximum pressure on the supreme leader is an entirely bipartisan priority. We must always do more. Enforcement can be tighter. Legislation with transparency mechanisms such as the Mahsa Act provide value to the Congress and our Iran policy oversight efforts. During committee consideration of the Mahsa Act, I voted to move the bill to the floor, despite having reservations that the text as currently drafted could damage national security waivers found in the underlying statute. Though the bill improved throughout the negotiation process with the majority, an amendment was offered which was adopted over the committee Democrats' objections that undermined some of the progress we achieved before markup. During a future conference process with the Senate, we want to assure this legislative text will not harm any president's ability to adjust to any potential national security event vis-a-vis Iran, including addressing the nuclear issue. We also hope to streamline the reporting requirements to make them feasible for OFAC and the Treasury Department to deliver to Congress. We look forward to continuing to work in a bipartisan manner on crafting a final bill that continues to put pressure on the supreme leader of Iran and those who support his nefarious efforts. In the meantime, I will vote to advance the current draft from the House in order to prepare for negotiations with the Senate. Therefore, I encourage my colleagues to join me in supporting this measure, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield as much time as you may consume to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Banks, the author of this bill.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
I thank the chairman for yielding, and I thank him for his leadership on this issue and so many other issues related to our foreign policy and national security. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to speak today in support of the passage of my bill, the Mahsa Act. As the chairman said, this bill is named in honor of Mahsa Amini, a young woman in Iran who was killed by the Iranian regime nearly, almost exactly a year ago this week. Mahsa died after being snatched off the street and brutally beaten by a patrol of the regime's so-called morality police, all because she was not wearing her headscarf correctly in public. Mahsa's murder triggered months of the largest pro-democracy and anti-regime protest in Iran since the 1979 revolution. Iranians called for freedom and chanted death to the dictator. Iranian women cast off their hijabs and burnt them in protest. They shook the regime to its core and showed the world that the Iranian people despise the Iranian regime. They will no longer tolerate its human rights abuses, corruption, and squandering of their wealth on terrorism. But the Biden administration refused to take real action in support of the protesters last year and has been looking the other way ever since. This administration is too afraid to jeopardize their dream of a new nuclear deal with Iran. So it's up to Congress to act instead, and that's what we're doing here today. The Mahsa Act will hold the most malicious elements of Iran's regime accountable while avoiding collateral damage on ordinary Iranians. My bill will require the administration to actually enforce sanctions on the books and to go after Mahsa's killers and the funders of terrorism, including the supreme leader of Iran, senior regime officials, and their money laundering organizations. I want to thank all of those from both parties who made this bipartisan legislation possible and to become a reality today. And more importantly, I want to thank all of those Iranian American groups here at home who showed their representatives how important it is to stand in support of the Iranian people and to finally take action to hold this brutal regime accountable. I call upon the Senate to immediately take up and pass the Mahsa Act. And I call upon President Biden to stop dragging his feet, listen to the Iranian people, and confront the Iranian regime once and for all. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Representative Lloyd Doggett.
The member is recognized.
Thank you. 1 year since the death of a young woman, Mahsa Amini, in Iran, 1 year during which revulsion to repression has given birth to so many courageous Iranians expressing their defiance of arbitrary restrictions on their freedom. But it's also been another year of torture and murder at the hands of a fanatical tyranny. With approval of this legislation, named for Mahsa, we say to Iranians, Your voices are heard, your voices are important, you are not forgotten. And while the type of military action against Iran urged by fanatics outside of Iran would be disastrous and counterproductive, through this act we seek to use all other available means to hold accountable the cruel repressors in Tehran. Those of us who are progressives, opposing any war against Iran, are equally opposed to the Iran war that the government is currently carrying out against its own children. We share the battle cry of peaceful Iranian protesters: woman, life, freedom. This bill has little to do with the Iran nuclear agreement, which was wisely negotiated by President Obama's administration and our European allies. The world is less safe today, not because of that agreement, but because of President Trump's abrupt unilateral cancellation of the agreement, presenting us today with an Iran that is nearer the development of a nuclear weapon than it was prior to the agreement. We need to be seeking to do everything we can to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon short of war. But our desire for a safer world should not impair our willingness to do more to make Iran safe for its own citizens. As Amnesty International reported just this past month, Iranian authorities have been subjecting victims' families to arbitrary arrest and detention, imposing cruel restrictions on peaceful gatherings at grave sites, and even destroying victims' grave markers. And now, within the last few days, detaining Mahsa's uncle so that he cannot speak out this Saturday on the anniversary of her murder. Already this year, the Iranian government has executed 320 people, doubling the rate prior to Mahsa's death, and giving Iran the wretched distinction of the highest number of executions per capita in the entire world. Building upon current existing executive orders, this bill proposes to codify existing sanctions targeting those at the top of the Iranian regime for their human rights abuses and for this egregious action of the last year. But the attacks on President Biden really are misplaced if this is to be a true bipartisan initiative. I believe that passage of the Mahsa Act sends a message to Iranians not about this administration, but of the fact that we, the elected members of the people of the United States, may I have another 30 seconds?
I offer the gentleman additional 30 seconds.
That passage of this act is not about what this administration has or has not done, but that it reflects the broad determination of this body, the Congress, the representatives of the people of the United States, to speak out against a brutal theocracy. We stand with Iranians who seek a brighter future with the rule of law and freedom, and hopefully one day an end to the terrible division between our two countries. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Speaker, I have no further speakers and reserve the right to close.
Gentleman reserves.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further requests for time at this time. I'm prepared to close if the other side has no further speakers.
The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume for the purpose of closing. I will vote in support of this measure, as it is crucial that we continue to pressure the supreme leader of Iran and his cronies and enablers. But I look forward to further refining the text with our Senate colleagues to make this the best bill possible. And I also note that I join Chairman McCall, Representative Doggett, in acknowledging that it has been nearly 1 year since the tragic death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini. We will always remember her global impact, not just for the girls and women of Iran, but for girls and women all over the world. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I first want to give my thanks to the ranking member, Mr. Meeks, to Congresswoman Madeline Dean, and to Congressman Lloyd Doggett. I also want to thank Representative Banks for leading this important bipartisan measure to ensure the United States upholds its moral responsibility as a beacon of freedom and human rights. This bill does not create any new sanctions programs. The tools we are discussing here today already exist. We are simply asking the administration to enforce them. We must do everything we can to stand with the people of Iran and prevent more violence and suffering. I feel for Mahsa's family, to see her being beaten, tortured, and put to death for the so-called crime of merely not wearing her hijab correctly is really unfathomable to Americans and our way of life in a free society, and it cannot stand. And I look forward to a day when the Ayatollah is out of power and the people of Iran can be free to express themselves without this kind of oppression and tyranny. I know it will happen one day, and I hope it happens in my lifetime. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 589 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative.
Mr. Speaker, on that I request the yeas and the nays.
Okay, the yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that the House suspend the rules and pass House Resolution 492.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 492, resolution condemning the government of Iran's state-sponsored persecution of the Baha'i minority and its continued violation of the international covenants on human rights.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, and the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean, will each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on this measure.
Without objection.
Thank you, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, as the Iranian regime continues to violate human rights, we must condemn the regime's state-sponsored persecution of the Baha'i minority and its other ongoing abuses. For the past year, Iran's barbaric human rights violations have faced renewed scrutiny following the regime's crackdown on peaceful protests after the murder of Mahsa Amini. Unfortunately, this sickening cruelty has become characteristic of the Iranian regime's control for over 40 years. The regime has consistently targeted the Baha'i and other religious minorities with harassment, discrimination, and violence. And for decades, the Iranian regime has terrorized the Baha'i who face arbitrary arrest, forced disappearances, property confiscation, and economic discrimination at the hands of the regime. Religious persecution in any form is repulsive, and we must condemn it in the strongest possible terms. That's why I co-sponsored this resolution, which the gentlelady from Illinois, Congresswoman Schakowsky, introduced. This measure details Iran's ongoing crimes against the Baha'i minority and calls for further action to address these serious human rights abuses. Congress will continue to stand with all the people of Iran to defend their rights, including religious freedom. I urge support for this measure and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of H.Res. 492 and yield myself as much time as I may consume. While the Congress is rightly concerned about Iran's nefarious nuclear program, its missile proliferation, and its destabilizing activities around the globe, we cannot forget those who continue to struggle for religious freedom and democracy in Iran. Iran's Baha'i community has long been the target of severe religious persecution by Iranian regime. Much of its informal leadership has been arrested, and many members of the community executed. The Baha'i are not permitted to practice their religion and culture. Their marriages are not recognized. Their dead cannot be buried according to Baha'i law, and their cemeteries are desecrated. In addition, the Baha'i are denied government jobs and business licenses. They are not permitted to enroll in public universities, and Baha'i school children are frequently harassed by classmates, teachers, and administrators. No human being deserves this type of treatment, and certainly not at the hands of their government. As has been noted in this House in the past, the social teaching of the Baha'i faith, such as the equality of women and men, the principle of each individual's responsibility to investigate the truth, are impossible for theocratic leaders of Iran to comprehend. Yet these are universal values, human values, and they must be protected. Mr. Speaker, the United States and the international community cannot and will not ignore the systematic and violent attacks against the Iranian Baha'i community, and Tehran must be held accountable. By passing this resolution once again, we continue to shine a light on the persecution of the Baha'i and hopefully move us one step closer to the day that true freedom reaches Iran. Therefore, I encourage my colleagues to join in supporting this measure, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve the right to close.
I have no further request for time, and I am prepared to close.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume for the purpose of closing. The House of Representatives has passed this resolution in previous Congresses. It will pass this resolution today, and if needed, we will pass this resolution again in the future. We stand in solidarity with the persecuted Baha'i minority in Iran and demand the Iranian government end its intolerable persecution of their people and religion. I urge unanimous passage of this resolution, and I yield the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Speaker. In closing, I'd like to thank Ranking Member Meeks, Congresswoman Dean, and the gentlelady from Illinois for offering this bipartisan resolution in support of human rights and religious freedom for the Baha'i community in Iran. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.